So turns out that second semifinal just turned out to be wrong on just about every count. I ended that video off being like, for all I know, Sinner proves me wrong, goes out there and puts forth, a truly remarkable performance, and truly is as good as, the blitzkrieg lead up of matches to this semifinal would have you believe. I asked the question, where are the big marquee Sinner wins on clay? Well, you have one in spades at least after today. And for that, I guess, all I can say is like, oops. Because, the performance Jannik Sinner put forth today, it's every bit, forthcoming of the all-time great player that he has rounded into. And, I do want to take a second to just, sort of eat crow for, the umpteenth time about this guy in the better part of the last 2 years since he's ascended to this level of player. And again, I didn't, give him the deference that the quality of player he's become, sort of deserves. And for every bit that, I sort of pat myself on the back that I feel like I saw Alcaraz turning into, the tank, the generational player that, he was touted to be. But I still think I was early to that train. I felt like I was pounding that drum even before US Open 2021. And, for all that I prop up the scouting on Alcaraz, I have been that much wrong on Sinner because, the way that it's evolved with him is the first time I really started paying attention to him, of course, was RG 2020, where he beats Zverev, and you could argue gives Nadal his toughest match of that tournament on Chatrier. And between that and, enjoying an actually really good 2021 as a teenager still, teenager into 20-year-old, of course, by the end of that year, and I think being top 10, getting to play in the World Tour Finals as an alternate, I want to say that year, I thought he was on schedule. I was like, looks like he's going to be a monster. And, all of a sudden, I just got super impatient by 2023. I am embarrassed to say this now, but between his results post-Miami 2023 up until basically US Open 2023, I was almost like, at that point, sort of like, are you guys serious? Like, this is the guy you think is going to be, side by side with Alcaraz into the next generation? Little did I know that, it was all just percolating. We were on the precipice of, a generational run out of Jannik Sinner as well. And even ever since then, I've been late to the party at every turn. After the fall of 23, I was like, all right, he's legit. It's not a fluky run, but I still think he's not in the tier of Djokovic Alcaraz. What he's done is great work. He'll get there in due time, and boom, a couple weeks later, he wins his first Australian Open, his first major, ending an unbeaten run of Novak's for 5 years on that court, on the way to doing so. And then, of course, the latest example here of, I know he's that guy on hard courts, but can he do it on clay? And sure he can. In fact, the phenomenon of, Novak looking into the mirror of his younger self whenever he's played this new version of Jannik Sinner has never looked more blatant, actually, than it did in this match. And at this point, there's nothing to say other than, I've been flat out late to the party wrong in that sense when it comes to Jannik Sinner, and that, feeling like I need to see it to believe it, which just shouldn't be the case with, a player that it shouldn't matter at this point, what court, what conditions, who he's playing against. He is one of two guys where nobody should bat an eye on tour right now if you just say the sky is the limit for them. And so that's one thing, that I needed to get off my chest. let's talk about the match. Why was that the case on this Friday night semifinal between Novak Djokovic and Jannik Sinner? Well, straight off the bat, Sinner came out and really pulled the curtain back on a lot of the reality of being a 38-year-old tennis player, and even when, only one other guy, I would say, has been at Djokovic's level at this point in their career, and that was Federer, throughout the course of 2019 into January, really, 2020, before the wheels fell off for him. And that really starts with the physicality aspect and how different it is against Sinner Alcaraz versus really anybody else on tour here. And I've kind of touched on how it's been a while, right? Like, it's really been about a year since Djokovic's legs have really been tested the full extent of best of 5 in slams, and it was at Roland Garros last year. But the thing is, there's a difference between that against Musetti, Cerundolo, and how it looks versus these two guys. Because I have known, I've been under the understanding that Djokovic has not been the cardio beast that he once was, where the guy could run for days, since 2021. After that year, I've seen on numerous occasions against one of these all-time greats or future all-time greats, multiple times I've seen, them being able to get to his legs. I saw him worse for wear against Rafa in that RG quarter in 22. I thought the same thing was the case in the Wimbledon 23 final, even though he had his chances there. By the end, I thought it was pretty clear that Alcaraz had his legs underneath him to a greater extent. In best of 3, actually, lesser so the case, maybe just because psychologically knowing that you only got to get 2 sets in the bag between the Cincy final and the Olympics final last year. But this was another case where that really stood out, and Novak has done such an exemplary job sort of manipulating the way that his matches go, the flow of those matches, to where you can't really exploit that part. He hasn't allowed a match to be played on those terms where you're gonna be able to break him down. And he's done so, obviously, expanding his repertoire, better at net, serve many times. The precision of it has earned him cheaper points, allowed him to play on the front foot, and, being more willing to just beef up the forehand on occasion and throw caution to the wind on that wing. But in this match, it really just was the heaviness and simultaneous shape and safety with which Sinner is always able to hit. That's the standout quality for him. And while I've felt like in 2024 at the Australian Open, Novak played really, really poorly, this match also was confirmation that, Sinner's just standard regulation tennis. It poses some very unique matchup problems for this iteration of Novak Djokovic, where on paper him being more errant is sort of unconsciously facilitated by the fact that he feels like he needs to go for more, and he's more on edge, he's pressing. Again, this is why the dialogue when these two have played the last couple times has been what it is since 2024, that it looks like Sinner is giving Djokovic his own medicine and out-Novaking Novak. Because that has been the guy, Novak Djokovic, for the last 15 years or so, that opponents feel like they need to press, they need to go for more and up the risk profile. And the way that I saw it, it was very blatant from the off that Sinner not really having to go outside his comfort zone, play very, very regulation safe tennis for him, just by virtue of the heaviness of his ball, if Djokovic was just gonna sit here and try to rally with him, it really was only going to take like one or two big cuts from Sinner to get him on defense, and he looked off kilter, off balance when doing so. This is a guy that, still is one of the best movers in the game in Novak Djokovic at 38, but he is very clearly a step slower than he used to be, and that's apparent for everybody that watched him back then. But let me tell you what, he never looks slower than he does against Jannik Sinner, because that ball's just getting on him all the more quicker than, anybody else can. And my impression was, I thought going into this match, the clay of it maybe could negate that, as far as some of the limitations present with, some of Djokovic's athletic decline at this stage in his career. But that wasn't the case at all, obviously. And for much of the first set, Novak's counter there to get himself out of, having to play too much defense ended up being tapping into the variety the same way that he was against Zverev. He was unsuccessfully deploying the dropper a lot, and he never really had much success with it all day until I think midway through the third set. He hadn't hit a drop shot winner, but he was especially going to it a lot in the first set, and Sinner obviously much more dexterous in handling the dropper than Zverev. But after that, he kind of stowed it away, and then the avenue for success for Djokovic was just throwing caution to the wind and redlining the forehand as much as he could. And yeah, either way, he was a lot more successful this way the rest of the match. But in both cases, just being wary of Sinner's baseline prowess and how it can consistently exploit the loss in Djokovic's speed at this point. Whether it was the droppers or whether it was redlining the forehand, it just forced Novak into some uncharacteristic and sometimes ill-advised shot selection choices in a vacuum. Now, holistically, this is exactly what he had to do. He tried literally everything. And again, as a 38-year-old with some of the athleticism, attributes diminished, this was the very narrow path to victory for him. On the outcome for Novak in a war of attrition, it became very, very clear. I think, truthfully, even the writing on the wall for that avenue was there for Djokovic himself, which is why he just upped the risk profile so much in these last two sets. And this is where it really felt like the shoe was on the other foot for what we've seen Djokovic do to just about everybody at some time or the other over the last 15 years or so, where, again, someone feels the need to have to go for more, to have to go bigger, and even ride that thin line and do it successfully and give themselves chances. That's what Djokovic was doing throughout the course of this second, third set. But, eventually operating at those thinner margins, eventually, when it came to crunch time and those make or break moments, still having to ride that thin line was all the more difficult. And this second set, it really took on a shape where it looked like it was must-win for Novak Djokovic. He continued to be, under duress on serve. That first set, I thought both guys came out pretty strong, and then Djokovic got the funny bounce on break point to be broken for the first time. He kind of went into a little bit of a funk the rest of that set. But in this second, he obviously, Jannik Sinner, had Novak's attention, and Djokovic was just scratching and clawing to stay connected. And then, the balls rolled to the other side, and Sinner looked completely unbothered. On the flip side, he was having to change absolutely nothing. Looked like he was playing completely within himself. And quite literally, for most of the first two sets, it continued. And that's something I didn't mention in my preview of this match. And, right after uploading it, I remembered that that was something that I had made note of, that in their last two matches, Novak had not created a break point in the 4 sets in Australia, in the 2 sets in Shanghai, and then I believe he did not create a break point in the first almost 2 full sets of this match. That too on clay, and again, I think that's another indicative thing where that's just unheard of with Novak Djokovic, and it's telling of the fact that he is clearly a lesser returner at this point than he used to be. And also it is telling that really for the first time, maybe ever, but at least in maybe a decade, you can legitimately say that somebody is posing a matchup issue for Novak Djokovic. Because, part of that also is just how imposing everybody, Novak included, knows that Jannik's just baseline standard tennis right now is against him. And that elicits some very uncharacteristic misses as well. You saw, I think, a love 30 before Djokovic got broken in the second set. That, you just saw a couple of uncharacteristic straight return misses that were very, very makeable for Novak, and it doesn't happen very often unless that person, just the threat of them, let alone, what's happening once the ball is in between the lines in play. Just the threat of Jannik is just a little bit unsettling. Not only do you see uncharacteristic shot choices, but you see in instances like that where he had openings, I think, in the first and especially in the second early on before he got broken, to get his teeth back into this match. And that's where you saw some just very uncharacteristic misses, particularly on the return. But then, of course, I thought you saw a repeat, a little bit of a microcosm of what happened when he saved match point in Australia in the tiebreaker in the third. And, you thought maybe it was like, okay, here he comes. Did Jannik maybe let him off the hook there? And that's what happened in the 5-4 service game, where Sinner to that point had not faced a break point still. And I think Novak understood. It was like now or nothing. He did a great job early in that game, getting his teeth into it. There's one really, really big forehand winner that I think gave him 15-30. And then the rest of the game, Sinner got a little bit sloppy and ended up getting broken. But, even as Djokovic raced out to 40-15 in the next game, it seemed like maybe could this be a moment to kind of swing the tide? And truth be told, right, to me at that point, I felt like I had seen enough in how the match just looked that Djokovic winning the second more so would just be like he's still alive, more than the typical if he takes the set, or really in the immediate aftermath against anybody else. If he breaks there at 5-4, you get the feeling of the inevitable, like, uh-oh, here he comes, maybe you open the door, here comes the freight train. But the way the match, the set in particular, had looked with Djokovic just, again, it seemed like he was just clawing on to stay connected by the skin of his teeth, riding just a very, very thin path to victory. And, again, that veered its ugly head on the Djokovic side. Because, like in the same way, as in the fourth in Australia, Sinner remained absolutely unfazed. It seemed like he too, just got the feel of this match, that it was being played on his racket. And if he didn't veer away too much, just was able to execute just standard Jannik Sinner tennis, which he wasn't really being impeded from doing, things were going to tip his way one way or the other. And of course, he quickly snuffed out those thoughts of, could that be costly, him opening the door there, because immediately after he came back from 40-15 down, broke back, and that felt like it was the dagger, honestly. That second set was must win for Djokovic to have a prayer in this match. And that set up for a third set where, regardless of if Novak was able to get back on the board, get a set on the board, the outcome kind of had been sealed at that point. It mostly felt like there was no way back for Novak, and quite truthfully, I thought there was a very real chance that, he would be demoralized, because I don't think it was just me. Everybody watching, probably Novak himself, understood the importance of that second set and how much he had thrown into trying to flip the outcome there. For it to be all for naught, it very easily could have taken the wind out of the sails. And truthfully, yeah, because of that, there was a great deal of admiration, I thought, that probably, everybody watching could sense. I mean, even the crowd was feeling it throughout the course of this match, really, and it didn't taper off, even in the face of the futility of the situation that he was in. But in sports, we always love a good old, he went out on his own sword. And, a lot of what makes these guys great champions and built completely different than all of us is, futile does not really exist in their dictionary, or it very, very rarely actually, overcomes them. And that's why you walk away from these 2 weeks on the Djokovic side of things. This is a big win for you. I mean, the level he played at beats certifiably everybody except for the top 2 players. In a match where it felt like he was running in quicksand and playing catch-up the entire way, I think he walks away with no regrets whatsoever. I mean, he tried literally everything he could. Of course, got himself to a position in the third where he brought up the set points, asked the questions of Jannik at the finish line, and even, I don't know if it's just nostalgia, his reputation precedes himself. There was a split second there where, despite logically the match basically being over after losing the second set, where there was a real tug of war there where, he made you believe for a split second. It's like, could he pull this off? Indeed, it was still over because, we got back to reality real quick. Jannik snuffed out those set points. But that's just what greatness is, man. It just makes you believe when you have no business doing so. And whether it comes from up top with Novak Djokovic, I've enjoyed it every time in recent memory when one of these vestiges of the golden era are just pushing back against seemingly insurmountable odds. Whether it's Monfils at the beginning of this tournament, both his matches against Delian and Draper, Baez a couple years ago as well against him. There have really been countless examples in recent memory. And yeah, there's just a little bit in that nostalgia vein that, just grows admiration all the more in those moments. Jannik Sinner, to his credit, just cold-blooded killer, unfazed. And yeah, that's pretty much what I can sum this up into in one word on Jannik Sinner's side of things, is through it all, he was unfazed. Whether it was baseline rallies with Djokovic, engaging in patterns that historically have favored Novak, but I felt Andy Roddick put in a great way. It was sort of like the Terminator 1 versus Terminator 2, where it's shoot him 4 times in the head, the second Terminator, and it's the new model just sort of liquid metal molds itself, right back into shape and keeps on chugging. And that's just it, By that point in the match, he felt inevitable. I thought it was a huge credit to Novak that he stuck around and made him earn it till the very end. And yeah, I thought it was great of the crowd the entire match. They were firmly behind the legend. They also probably were a big part why the air never, went out of Novak's sails. And for the remainder of the match into that tiebreak, same things persisted. Djokovic feeling like he had to press, resulting in, a handful of uncharacteristic unforced errors that, I don't know that you can really call unforced anymore in the context of this matchup, because, that's just what it entails. It is a very, very narrow path to victory that will only get more narrow for Novak as he ages, but, a tip of the cap, of course, for, not at any point being resigned to his fate, even though probably the writing on the wall was there for how this match was going since mid-second set. And that's all just a credit to just what a perfect, algorithm machine Sinner's game has turned into. And like many have noted, it just kind of feels like the next evolution of Djokovic himself. It's sort of just, an extension of Novak, if you will. And one last note on the crowd, I thought that it was great, especially in stark contrast to, a little bit of the disrespectful note that Novak ended up walking off Rod Laver Arena on earlier this January with a handful of people booing. But it was real nice to see Djokovic get that ovation, even though this has been the slam where he has lost the most at the business end, as you know, credited to one guy mostly. He's had some of his most, poignant moments over the last couple years in particular, but really all the way back to like 2015-16. It sort of bookended that dynastic run of his where he held all 4 slams, and going from like heartbreak where he lost to Stan and they gave him that long extended ovation in the ceremony, even as the runner-up, that coming full circle a year later, completing his career slam at long last. Obviously 21, one of the most unforgettable tournaments of his career, and then 23 where he became the slam leader, and it wasn't even over because last year, of course, he had another landmark moment in Paris, winning the Olympic gold medal on his 5th attempt. Frankly, that did look like goodbye, I can't speak for him, but it seemed like probably in real time I would assume that, the mind was playing back a lot of those exact memories on that court, which was, nice to watch him just take it all in, put his bags down, kiss the court. If that's it for him in Paris, I genuinely think the way things stand right now, he's a top 3 clay court player of all time, and it's been one hell of a run of consistency, of heartbreak, of emotional highs, spanning from today all the way back to 2006. Though for his, immediate future, the way that he played, he can only take confidence heading to the grass court season. Best believe he'll be back in the mix at SW19 in a couple weeks. But for now, we get a sort of a dream final. There was no losing here, regardless of who won this match. We were guaranteed a great final. And Sinner Alcaraz, for the first time in a slam final, weeks after the first time they contested their first big final, it's all kinds of awesome. And again, best believe Jannik has made me reevaluate how I see his prospects for victory. I'm definitely rating them a whole lot better now than I was 24 hours ago. I mean, again, we're taking it for granted with Sinner. I already said that yesterday, that, we're sort of numbed to the fact that not only does he barely lose, but he destroys most of the people he's playing. And the fact that that hasn't changed on the other side of this 3-month suspension, all you can say is just bravo. It's one hell of a player, that's one hell of a talent, that you don't really need that many matches and just hit the ground running. I did say after the Rome final that I only expect Sinner to continue to get better. I feel like that's always a really hard place to be when you're coming back, is, just a huge ramp up going from playing, in his case, the mere mortals, to playing another fellow superhuman in Alcaraz, and he just wasn't ready for that challenge immediately. And indeed, he has continued to get better at Roland Garros, and this time around, when still, even 38-year-old Novak, that's probably still a guy that can hit that superhuman ceiling, and he definitely gave it everything he could handle here. And only a couple weeks later, Sinner clearly much more up to the task than he was in his first tournament back. And it only makes me salivate all that much more for this final coming up. But that'll do it for this video. If you stuck around this long, thank you so much for watching. I hope that you enjoyed. If you did, it would be much appreciated if you could drop a like, help this video perform a lot better in YouTube's algorithm, and also subscribe to the channel if you're not already. Thank you all again so much for watching, and of course, I will see y'all in the next one.